The North Sea, June 1940, a Royal Navy aircraft carrier burns and rolls onto her side off the coast of Norway. Her name is HMS Glorious. 2 German battleships have caught her in the open ocean, without air cover, without escorts, and in 90 minutes of gunfire they will send her to the bottom with 1,200 men. A young Royal Navy lieutenant, 32 years old, is not on board. His name is Dennis Cambell. 2 weeks earlier, he had commanded 803 Naval Air Squadron on that ship. 2 weeks earlier, he had walked those decks, drunk with those officers, briefed those pilots, and then a routine administrative transfer had lifted him ashore. A piece of paper, a signature, the kind of order that changes nothing except everything. Glorious went to Norway without him. 1,200 men did not come home. Cambell did. That is the first thing you need to know about the man who will one day save more naval aviators than any weapon ever built. He knew from the age of 32 that he was alive by accident. He knew what the sea did to men. He knew what a bad decision on a flight deck cost. He never forgot it, and in the years that followed the war, the United States Navy would kill more of its own pilots than the enemy ever managed. Not in combat, on the flight decks, sons of Kansas, boys from Alabama, naval aviators who launched from Norfolk and Pensacola and never came home. 2 American pilots every day, on average, throughout the peacetime year of 1951. And the only man on earth who would call that a design problem, and not an act of God, was not an admiral, not an engineer, not a war hero. He was a paper-pushing bureaucrat in London, with a pencil. Naval aviation in the Second World War killed the men who flew faster than the enemy did. Storms, fog, deck accidents, malfunctions. A carrier pilot's most dangerous enemy was never a German fighter or a Japanese destroyer. It was the 200 feet of steel he called home. Landing on a moving ship at night in weather remained the most lethal peacetime skill the human race had ever invented. Cambell knew this. By 1942, aboard HMS Argus, deck accidents were routine. Every man in the fleet air arm had lost friends the same way. Not to enemy fighters. To their own ships. Cambell earned a Distinguished Service Cross for his wartime service. He wore it once at the ceremony. Then he put it in a drawer, because the men who deserved it more were dead, cut to 11 years later. Ministry of Supply, London, August 1951. A middle-aged man in a navy blue uniform sits at a desk, stacked with paper. His hair has thinned. His hands are ink-stained now, not oil-stained. He has not flown an aircraft off a carrier in almost 5 years. He is 43 years old, a captain in the Royal Navy, and his official title reads Deputy Chief Naval Representative, Air. His job is meetings, his job is coordination, his job is watching from a great administrative distance as the profession he loves tears itself apart. Because this is 1951, and in 1951 the aircraft carrier is dying, not from bombs, from physics. Somewhere off the coast of Korea, at this exact moment, American carriers are launching jets. Grumman F-9F Panthers, McDonnell Banshees, sleek, fast, beautiful, and utterly terrifyingly incompatible with the ships they take off from. A propeller fighter in 1943 landed at 70 knots. A jet in 1951 lands at 130, that is 40 extra knots of kinetic energy hitting fixed steel cables stretched across a fixed steel deck. A jet engine in 1951 takes 6 seconds to spool up from idle to full thrust. 6 seconds. In a propeller aircraft, 6 seconds means nothing. In a jet approaching a carrier, 6 seconds is the difference between a life and a funeral, because if you miss the arresting wire in a jet, you cannot go around. Not really. Not the way you could in a Corsair or a Hellcat. The engine takes too long. You are committed. You are already touching down, and ahead of you, 60 feet ahead, is a steel crash barrier, and beyond that barrier, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. Fuel trucks, ordnance carts, men. Every landing is a bet against physics. In 1951, the United States Navy will lose 776 aircraft to non-combat mishaps. More than 2 a day, in peacetime. The Royal Navy's numbers per aircraft are worse. Everyone knows it. The admirals know it. The engineers know it, the pilots certainly know it, but nobody knows what to do. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, they are experimenting with rubberized flight decks. The theory is that a jet fighter, stripped of its landing gear to save weight, can belly land onto a soft surface and be caught by wires. The theory works. The practice terrifies the test pilots. Nobody wants to belly a 15-ton jet onto rubber sheeting at 130 knots. It is madness, but it is the best idea anyone has. In Washington, the Bureau of Aeronautics is pouring millions of dollars into better crash barriers. Stronger cables, bigger stanchions. The logic is simple. If you cannot stop the accidents from happening, at least you can stop them from killing everyone forward of the wire. It is not a solution. It is triage. Captain Dennis Cambell sees all of this from his desk in London. Reads the accident reports, signs the requisitions, attends the meetings, and thinks about the men who died on HMS Argus. Nothing has changed, only the aircraft are faster. Now here is the first thing that will surprise you. The man who is about to solve one of the greatest crises in the history of naval aviation is not a jet pilot. He has never flown a jet, he has never landed a jet. His entire flying career was spent in aircraft made of fabric and wood, aircraft that could land at 60 knots into a headwind, aircraft that were obsolete before the war he flew them in was even over. He is not an engineer, he has no advanced degree, he cannot read a stress calculation, he cannot draw a lift curve. When Farnborough scientists talk about angle of attack and glide slope geometry, he nods politely and asks them to please explain it again in plain English. He is a bureaucrat. On paper, in title, in every measurable metric of the Royal Navy hierarchy, he is a bureaucrat. And that is exactly why it works. Because Dennis Cambell is going to solve this problem the way engineers cannot solve it. Not with mathematics, with a pencil sketch, not with theory, with a question so simple no one has ever asked it before. But that comes later. First this, second thing that will surprise you. The idea does not come to Cambell at a funeral. It does not come to him at a graveside. It does not come to him in a moment of grief for a fallen friend. Popular myth loves to tell that story, the great invention born of tragedy, the tears that became a revolution. This is not that story. The idea comes to Cambell in a meeting, a boring meeting, an ordinary Tuesday, August 1951, Ministry of Supply, room number long forgotten. Cambell is chairing a discussion on the future design of naval aircraft. Around the table sit engineers, scientists, aviators. The topic is dry. The tea has gone cold. Someone is presenting slides. Someone else is arguing about undercarriage weight allowances. And Dennis Cambell, listening, begins to doodle in the margin of his notepad. He draws a flight deck, a rectangle, a straight line down the middle. This is how every aircraft carrier in the world has been laid out since 1918. Landing area at the stern, parking area at the bow, barrier between them, simple, obvious. He draws it again. But this time he tilts the landing strip, a few degrees off center, angled to port, so that if an aircraft misses the wires, it does not head into the parked aircraft ahead. It heads out over open water. He looks at the sketch. He blinks. Then, very quietly, in the middle of a meeting that is discussing something else entirely, Captain Dennis Cambell realizes he may have just solved the problem that has been killing naval aviators for 6 years. He does not announce it. He does not stand up and shout Eureka. He circles the sketch with his pencil, tears the page out, folds it, and puts it in his uniform pocket. 2 weeks later, at another meeting, he shows it. The reaction, in his own later words, is one of indifference amounting almost to derision. Indifference, almost derision. Read those words again. This is the Royal Navy Admiralty in 1951, being shown the diagram that will save more lives than every arresting cable, every crash barrier, every safety innovation in the history of carrier aviation combined. And they cannot be bothered. One senior officer suggests that pilots will find it difficult to adjust. Another suggests it violates something called axis of motion doctrine. A third simply says nothing at all, which is perhaps the worst response of the three. Cambell packs up his sketch. He walks back to his office. He puts the drawing in a drawer, on top of the drawer that holds his Distinguished Service Cross, and he goes home to his wife. Later, he will describe what he felt that evening as something close to embarrassment. Not anger, not defiance, embarrassment. He had brought a schoolboy's doodle to a room of professionals, and they had responded exactly the way one responds to a schoolboy. He almost lets it go. Almost, because what Dennis Cambell does not know, cannot know, as he walks home through the London twilight with his sketch back in a drawer, is that one man in that meeting room did not react with indifference. One man watched him leave and then quietly reopened the notepad and then quietly made a phone call. That man was not in the Royal Navy. That man was a civilian, and what he did next is the reason you are alive to hear this story, if your father or grandfather ever flew a jet off a carrier deck. Because the man who saved Dennis Cambell's idea was not an admiral, he was a scientist, and he had at that exact moment been struggling for 2 years with a problem of his own. A problem that Cambell's little sketch drawn in the margin of a boring meeting had just solved. His name was Louis Boddington. He wore no uniform, he carried no rank, he was in the strict language of the Royal Navy a nobody. A civilian, a man with a briefcase and a slide rule and an office at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, in a low brick building surrounded by wind tunnels and hangars and the smell of aviation fuel. But inside that building, Louis Boddington ran everything, head of the Naval Aircraft Department. The senior scientist responsible for every problem the Royal Navy would not solve with steel or steam or seamanship. When an aircraft carrier had a question about aerodynamics, they asked Boddington. When a designer wanted to know if a wing would hold together at 400 knots, they asked Boddington. He was a quiet man, thin-lipped, balding, in his 40s. He wore a round spectacle and a sensible tweed jacket, and he almost never raised his voice. For 2 years, Louis Boddington had been losing sleep over a problem the Admiralty had handed him. It was called the flexible deck. The idea on paper was elegant. Jet fighters were getting heavier because their undercarriages had to withstand enormous landing forces. If you removed the undercarriage entirely, the aircraft would be lighter, faster, cheaper. But without landing gear, how do you land? Answer: you do not. You crash. Onto a rubber mat. Farnborough had built one, a great flexible landing surface, cushioned by inflated rubber bladders, that could theoretically catch a wheelless jet at 130 knots. Test pilots had proven it worked. Eric Brown, the Royal Navy's chief test pilot, had made 40 landings on the thing. In private, he called it terrifying. Boddington's problem was not the landing. Boddington's problem was what happened next. Once a jet had crash-landed on the rubber deck, how did you get it off? How did you clear the mat for the next aircraft? Every proposal Farnborough drew up ended the same way. A trolley system that took too long. A crane that was too slow. A mechanical clearance rig that jammed. On a real carrier in real combat, the flexible deck would jam solid within 10 landings. And any aircraft still airborne would have nowhere to go. For 2 years, Louis Boddington had been trying to solve this problem, and he had failed. He had failed, and men were dying while he failed. Which is why, on that afternoon in August 1951, when a Royal Navy captain named Dennis Cambell held up a schoolboy's doodle at a Ministry of Supply meeting and was met with indifference, Louis Boddington did not laugh. He leaned forward, he looked at the sketch, and he saw in an instant what a room full of admirals had missed. Cambell had drawn the landing area at an angle, but Boddington was not looking at the landing area. Boddington was looking at the space to the right of it. The starboard side, because if the landing runway was slewed off to port, then the entire forward starboard section of the flight deck was now free. Free to be a parking area, free to be a takeoff area, free to be in effect an entirely separate ship. For the first time in the history of aircraft carriers, one ship could land aircraft and launch aircraft at the same time. Not sequentially, simultaneously, and every landing aircraft that missed the wires would simply throttle up and fly back out over open water, because there was nothing ahead of it to hit. Boddington sat very still. The meeting ended. Chair scraped. Officers filed out. Cambell packed up his notepad and moved toward the door. And Louis Boddington, quietly in his sensible tweed jacket, stopped him. "May I see that sketch again?" Cambell handed it over. Boddington studied it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he took his own pencil, and in the corner of the drawing he added a small correction. A curve where the port edge of the angled deck met the main deck to fair the geometry into the hull. It was a detail, almost invisible. Cambell would remember that pencil mark for the rest of his life, because that pencil mark was the moment his idea stopped being a doodle. That pencil mark was the moment it became an aircraft carrier. For the next 3 weeks, the two men worked in a kind of quiet conspiracy. Boddington, at Farnborough, ran the numbers. Cambell, at the Ministry, drafted the proposals. They avoided the Admiralty. They avoided the committees. They did what they had to do because they both understood one thing that the admirals did not. If they announced this too soon, it would be killed. If they waited too long, more men would die. It was Boddington who suggested painting the outline on a real carrier deck. Not a wind tunnel model, not a computer simulation. There were no computer simulations in 1951. Paint, white paint, on the wooden deck of a Royal Navy ship. Let pilots fly touch-and-go approaches to a runway that was not really there and see if the theory held. But no British admiral was going to authorize painting stripes on the deck of a working aircraft carrier for a theory nobody understood. Which is where the story takes its next turn, and here is the twist that history books almost never tell you correctly. Because if you have ever heard this story before, you have probably heard it told as a triumph of British ingenuity rescued from British indifference by American enthusiasm. The plucky Royal Navy officer whose own service ignored him until the Americans took notice. That is not what happened. What happened is stranger, because at the exact moment Dennis Cambell was drawing his sketch in a London meeting room in August of 1951, engineers at the Naval Air Test Centre at Patuxent River, Maryland, had been quietly exploring the same problem on paper for years. Cambell did not know this. Boddington did not know this. Nobody at the Ministry of Supply knew this. The Americans had approached geometry calculations. They had wind tunnel discussions. They had informal drawings that hinted at the concept. What they did not have was a carrier willing to try it. What they did not have was a champion inside their own navy senior enough to force the issue. What they did not have was Dennis Cambell. The two lines of research had been running in parallel. Two nations, two teams, neither aware of the other, both stuck at the same wall. And in September of 1951, at the Farnborough Air Show, those two lines of research met. Cambell was there, Boddington was there. And so were three officers of the United States Navy on liaison duty, wandering through the exhibits with polite British admirals who were trying not to talk about crash statistics. Cambell mentioned the sketch, casually, over drinks, in the way that a British captain, worn down by Admiralty indifference, mentions an idea he no longer expects anyone to take seriously. The Americans stopped drinking. They asked him to say it again. They asked him to draw it. And in the weeks after the Farnborough Air Show closed its gates that autumn, word reached the Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington through informal channels, quiet channels, the kind of channels that carry ideas the official chain of command has already dismissed. A Royal Navy captain, they were told, had just described in casual conversation the exact solution the Americans had been circling on paper for years. That is when everything changed, not because the Royal Navy changed, because the American Navy did. In February of 1952, HMS Triumph put to sea with a bold white line painted at 8 degrees off her centre line. No modifications, no structural work, just paint. Royal Navy pilots flew Supermarine Attackers and Gloucester Meteors to the painted deck, executing touch-and-go approaches, pretending the line was the edge of a runway that did not yet exist. The drift the admirals had predicted did not materialize. The pilots adapted within 2 landings. One British test pilot, after his third approach, climbed down and told the trial observers that flying an angled approach felt different, safer, that a pilot who missed the wires no longer felt the 60 feet of steel barricade waiting for him at the end. A painted white line, drawn by a bureaucrat, corrected by a scientist, tested by young pilots who had spent their entire careers waiting to die on an approach that had finally been redesigned. In March of 1952, further trials on HMS Illustrious, same result. In May of 1952, from the 26th to the 29th, USS Midway ran her own simulated angled deck trials in the Atlantic. Same result. And by June of that year, the United States Bureau of Ships had made a decision that the Royal Navy Admiralty had refused to make. They were going to build a real one, not paint. Steel, a structural sponson welded to the port side of a working aircraft carrier that would extend the landing area at a true 8-degree angle out over the water. The arresting gear would be realigned, the deck would be recambered, the concept would be tested not in theory, but in operation. The ship chosen for the experiment was USS Antietam, CV-36, an Essex-class carrier commissioned in the closing months of the Second World War, veteran of Korea. She was pulled from active service in September of 1952 and sent to the New York Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn for 3 months of modification. The work was not glamorous. A great steel outrigger, welded to the port quarter, cambered gently downward, the arresting cables torn out and relaid. The barrier removed, the deck repainted. In photographs from the yard, she looks not revolutionary but strange, a ship with a growth. A carrier with something extra hanging off her side. She sailed on the 10th of January 1953, destination the Virginia Capes. 2 days later, on the 12th of January, in choppy winter seas off the Virginia coast, a single-engine aircraft turned into the wind and began its approach to her deck. Now here is the moment history rearranges itself, because if you were told this story on a movie screen, the first landing on the world's first true angled flight deck would be made by a young naval aviator. A jet pilot, a hero in his 20s, flying a Panther on a knife-edge approach with the fate of naval aviation hanging in the balance. That is not what happened. The first arrested landing on an angled flight deck in the history of the world was made by the ship's own commanding officer. His name was Captain Sherman Mitchell, United States Navy. He had been in the service since before Pearl Harbor. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and thousands of hours in his logbook. And he was not flying a jet, he was flying an SNJ Texan, a propeller trainer, a two-seat radial engine student aircraft that could land at 70 knots. The same kind of aeroplane naval cadets used for their very first solo carrier approaches. Slow, docile, forgiving, Mitchell had chosen it deliberately. Because he did not know if his ship's new deck was going to work, nobody did. And if the first landing failed, if the first pilot to test the concept died on international newsreel, the angled deck program would end that afternoon. So the captain took it himself. He rolled the Texan into the pattern. He set his approach. He watched the strange, canted line of white paint slide beneath his nose. He caught the wire. The aircraft stopped. He unstrapped. He climbed down. He walked forward on his own deck, past sailors who were not yet applauding because they did not yet understand what they had just witnessed. Over the next 4 days, from the 12th of January to the 16th, USS Antietam conducted more than 500 landings on that angled deck. Day landings, night landings, jets, propeller aircraft, fighter pilots, trainee pilots, pilots with over 1,000 hours and pilots with under 50 hours of jet time. 0 fatalities, 0 barrier crashes, 0 destroyed aircraft. In an era when American carrier aviation was averaging more than 2 Class A MASPs every single day of the year, the world's first angled deck operated for 96 consecutive hours without so much as a scratch. The admirals in London who had once waved Cambell's sketch away were about to receive a telegram from Washington, and that telegram was going to be very hard to ignore. Because the United States Navy had just decided, in 1 week, in one ship, in one experiment, to change the way every aircraft carrier in the world would be built for the next 70 years. And they had done it using a sketch drawn by a Royal Navy bureaucrat in the margin of a boring meeting in a country whose own admirals had told him to sit down and be quiet. The telegram arrived in London in late January of 1953. It was not long. Naval communications rarely are, but every word in it carried the weight of a decision the Admiralty could no longer avoid. The Americans had done it. The Americans had proven it. And the Americans, having proven it, were now beginning the most ambitious carrier modernization program in the history of the United States Navy. The Bureau of Ships called it SCEB 125. On paper it was an engineering upgrade, in reality it was a revolution. Every carrier of the Essex class, every carrier of the Midway class, every hull large enough to justify the yard time. All of them, over the next 5 years, were going to be cut open, welded back together and given angled decks. And in Newport News, Virginia, the keel was already being laid for something even greater, USS Forrestal, CVA-59, not a modification. Not a refit, not a compromise between wartime steel and jet-age geometry. Forrestal was the first supercarrier in history conceived from her initial blueprints with an angled flight deck at the center of her design. Nearly 60,000 tons at standard displacement, over 1,000 feet long, steam catapults, optical landing systems, and, tilted 8 degrees off her center line, the elegant canted landing strip that Dennis Cambell had drawn in the margin of a notepad 30 months earlier. She would be commissioned in October of 1955. By then, the Americans had built an entirely new form of naval warfare around Cambell's sketch. And every navy in the Western world was scrambling to catch up. The French, the Australians, the Canadians, the Dutch. All of them. And here is the twist that history books almost never dwell on, because the last major navy in the world to adopt the angled flight deck was the Royal Navy, the service that had produced Cambell, the service that had trained him, promoted him, given him his uniform and his rank and his Distinguished Service Cross. The service that in August of 1951 had told him to sit down and be quiet. That service was now, in 1954, quietly and without fanfare sending HMS Centaur to the dockyard. Centaur was a light fleet carrier, modest, serviceable, nothing extraordinary. But in her refit, the shipwrights welded a sponson to her port quarter, extended her landing area outboard at an angle, and gave the Royal Navy its first operational angled deck. 2 years after the Americans, 3 years after the sketch, and every man in the Admiralty who had ever sat in that meeting room and dismissed Cambell's drawing knew, without ever quite saying it out loud, what had just happened. Which is when someone in Whitehall, whose name is not recorded, made a decision that redeemed everything. They gave Dennis Cambell command of the ship. Not Centaur, something bigger, HMS Ark Royal, the fourth ship of that name, the pride of the post-war Fleet Air Arm. Her keel had been laid at Camel Laird in Birkenhead in 1943, and she had spent nearly a decade under construction, her design revised again and again as jet aviation changed everything. When Cambell's sketch reached the drawing office, Ark Royal had already been in the water for over a year, her hull afloat but her flight deck unfinished, her interior system still going in. The engineers stopped. They tore up the flight deck plans. They redrew them from scratch. And when she was finally commissioned, she became the first British aircraft carrier ever to enter service with a full angled deck integrated into her completed design. Not painted on, not bolted on as an afterthought, built in. Ark Royal was Cambell's diagram, given hull form, given steel plating, given 43,000 tons of engineering. She was commissioned on the 25th of February 1955, and her first captain was Dennis Royal Farquharson Cambell, 47 years old. Still a captain, Royal Navy, standing on the flag bridge of the ship that his own service had once refused to build. He said nothing about it. He gave no interviews. He accepted no medals for the deck design itself. When reporters asked him about the angled deck, he directed them to Louis Boddington at Farnfrower, and to the scientists, and to the American naval aviators who had made the first landings. He was a captain in command of a ship. That was the only story he wanted told. For 18 months he marchanded Ark Royal in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, in the North Sea. Fighter squadrons launched from her bow, while other fighters landed on her angled portside runway, simultaneously, safely, without collision, the way it had never been done before. The way it has been done ever since. But there is one more thing you need to know, because if you have followed this story so far, you may have come to believe that Dennis Cambell alone solved the crisis of jet-age carrier aviation. That one man with one sketch saved thousands of lives. He did not alone. Because at the same time Cambell was drawing his angled deck, another Royal Navy officer was working on a separate problem. His name was Nicholas Goodhart. He was a lieutenant commander. He was 32 years old. He was a test pilot and an engineer, which is a rare combination, and he was obsessed with a different question. Even if you gave a pilot an angled deck to land on, how did he know where he was? At 130 knots, at night, in weather, closing on a moving ship, a pilot had perhaps 20 seconds to judge his glide slope. And human eyes, in those 20 seconds, made errors that killed. The landing signal officer, waving paddles from the port quarter, was a Second World War solution to a First World War problem, and jets had already outpaced him. In 1951, the same year Cambell drew his sketch, Nicholas Goodhart invented the mirror landing system, a curved mirror mounted on the port side of the flight deck. A bright light shone into it from behind the ship. As the pilot approached, the reflection of that light appeared as a glowing ball on the mirror. If the ball was centered between two horizontal reference bars, his glide slope was perfect. If it drifted high, he was too high. If it drifted low, he was too low. A pilot could read it in a fraction of a second. The Royal Navy adopted it in 1954. The Americans adopted it in 1955. And here is what almost no one understands about this story. Without Goodhart's mirror, Cambell's angled deck was only half a solution. Without Cambell's angled deck, Goodhart's mirror was only half a solution. Together, they were something else entirely. Together, they were the reason jet aviation from aircraft carriers became not only possible, but ordinary. Together, they cut the class and mishap rate of United States Navy carrier aviation by more than half within 4 years of full implementation. Together, they saved the lives of a generation of Cold War pilots who never once thought to thank them because they never knew their names. Cambell, Boddington, Goodhart, and on the far side of the Atlantic, Sherman Mitchell, the American captain who flew the first landing himself in a slow propeller trainer because he was not willing to gamble somebody else's son on an experiment he could not yet guarantee. 4 men. The angled deck was drawn by a bureaucrat, refined by a scientist, completed by an engineer, and proven by an American who took the risk in his own aircraft on his own deck in the middle of the winter of 1953. That is the true story, not one man, not one moment. A quiet chain of ordinary human beings, each solving a piece of a problem that killed people they had never met. Dennis Cambell retired from the Royal Navy in 1960, Rear Admiral, Companion of the Order of the Bath, Officer of the American Legion of Merit, presented to him by the United States Navy in gratitude for a sketch drawn in a London office 9 years earlier. He never patented the angled deck, he never took a royalty, he never gave the interview a newspaper reporter would have paid for. He worked in aviation consulting for another decade. He grew old quietly. He read history books in a small house in the south of England. He was survived by his family and by every carrier pilot who ever missed a wire, went round and lived to land again. Louis Boddington, the scientist who had rescued the sketch from Admiralty indifference, died in January of 1994. He was in his 80s. His obituary in the technical journals was brief. Dennis Cambell died on the 6th of April in the year 2000. He was 92 years old. His obituary in the Daily Telegraph ran to a few paragraphs. The Guardian gave him a little more. Both mentioned the angled deck. Neither quite captured what it meant. What it meant is this: every aircraft carrier in the world today, American, British, French, Italian, Indian, Chinese, Russian, every single one of them, angled deck, 8 degrees off centerline, landing runway pointed out over open water, parking area to starboard, simultaneous launch and recovery, all of it, Cambell's sketch. Every carrier pilot flying today in the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps has bolted at some point in his career. Missed the wires, poured on throttle, climbed back into the pattern, tried again. Every one of them is alive because a man in a London office in August of 1951 was bored in a meeting. That is the whole story. A man was bored in a meeting. He drew a picture. His own service told him to sit down. A civilian scientist quietly rescued the drawing. American officers listened when their own admirals would not. An American captain named Mitchell risked his own life on the first test. And now, 70 years later, on flight decks in the Pacific and the Persian Gulf and the North Atlantic, young Americans launch and land in aircraft that would have killed them, without exception, on any carrier deck built before 1953. Now think about that. Think about the aviator you knew, the neighbor who flew off Coral Sea, the uncle who served on Enterprise, the son who came home from the Persian Gulf. Every one of them owes a debt they never knew they owed. To 4 men who never met around the same table, never shared credit, never asked for it, no monuments, no holidays. No parades, just a sketch, and a painted white line, and a promise made quietly by ordinary people in ordinary rooms that good men should not have to die for a bad design. That is the promise they kept. That is the story that no one told you. That is why the men you flew with came home.